clutched in her trembling hands was the heavy, rusted box her family laughed at the final insult from a grandmother she had sacrificed everything for. Yet when the snooty antique dealer wiped away the grime, his breath hitched. He didn't offer her cash. Instead, he collapsed into a weeping mess. Dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon sunlight, piercing the heavy velvet drapes of Arthur Pendleton's law office in downtown Boston. The room smelled of old paper-expensive leather and unspoken greed. Abigail Prescott sat rigidly in a high-backed mahogany chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her black morning dress, bought off the clearance rack at a discount department store, stood in stark contrast to the designer garments worn by the other occupants of the room. To her left sat her older brother, Harrison Prescott, checking his Rolex watch with an air of profound impatience. Beside him was his wife Cynthia, who absent-mindedly twisted a diamond ring the size of a marble on her manicured finger. Across the room, leaning against a bookshelf full of legal volumes, was their cousin Reginald. They had all gathered for the final reading of Eleanor Prescott's last will and testament. Eleanor Prescott had been a formidable woman, a matriarch who commanded a vast shipping and real estate empire. For the last 5 years of her life, however, she had been a prisoner of her own failing body. When the dementia and physical frailty set in, Harrison had immediately relocated to a villa in Tuscany, claiming he could not bear to watch his beloved grandmother deteriorate. Cynthia had cited a fragile nervous system to avoid visiting the nursing wing of the Prescott estate. Reginald simply stopped returning phone calls. It was Abigail who had put her life on hold. She had abandoned her graduate studies, moved into the drafty, oppressive estate, and spent half a decade changing soiled bed linens, administering morphine drops, and holding Eleanor's frail, spotted hand through endless, terrifying nights. She had given up her 20s to ensure her grandmother did not die, alone, surrounded only by paid staff. Arthur Pendleton, a man whose face seemed permanently creased in a frown, cleared his throat and adjusted his spectacles. "If we are all settled," he began, his voice dry as parchment, "I shall commence." The reading was a masterclass in unequal distribution. Abigail listened in silence as Harrison was awarded the sprawling Chestnut Hill mansion, the family's primary stock portfolio, and a lucrative commercial property in Manhattan assets, totaling well over $40 million. Cynthia, who had not spoken to Eleanor in 3 years, was bequeathed the entire Prescott jewelry collection, including a famous sapphire parure, rumored to have belonged to Russian nobility. Reginald received a generous trust fund that would ensure he never had to work a day in his life. Abigail felt a hollow ache forming in her chest. She didn't want millions. She had only hoped for enough to clear the crushing debt she had accumulated while living on a meager caregiver's stipend, perhaps enough to finally return to school. And finally, Pendleton read, pausing slightly, as his eyes scanned the thick, cream-colored paper. "To my granddaughter Abigail. For her steadfast presence during my twilight years, I leave the contents of the safe in the eastern attic, specifically the iron strongbox and all the weight it represents." Harrison snorted a sharp, ugly sound in the quiet room. "The attic," he whispered loudly to Cynthia. "Is she inheriting the bats?" Pendleton reached behind his desk and hoisted a bulky, misshapen object onto the polished oak surface. It landed with a dull, heavy thud that rattled the lawyer's pen cup. Abigail stared at it. It was a box roughly the size of a toaster, but it looked like something excavated from a swamp. It was made of blackened, heavily oxidized iron, patched with patches of verdigris-stained brass. It was utterly devoid of elegance, covered in a thick layer of soot rust and hardened grime. A large, primitive padlock, thoroughly fused with rust, hung uselessly from the front clasp. It looked like a piece of industrial scrap, completely out of place among the refined antiques of the Prescott family. Cynthia let out a sharp, mocking laugh, quickly raising a hand to her mouth in mock apology. "Oh, Abigail, darling, how rustic. It really suits your bohemian aesthetic, doesn't it? Grandmother always did have a twisted sense of humor, Harrison drawled, standing up and buttoning his bespoke suit jacket. Well, I suppose it's fitting. You always were fond of spending time in the dust. Mr. Pendleton, if we are finished here, my broker is expecting my call. Abigail felt the heat of humiliation prickling at the back of her neck. She stood up, her legs feeling like lead. She walked over to the desk and placed her hands on the cold, rough metal of the box. It was incredibly heavy-dense and unforgiving. "Is there a key, Mr. Pendleton?" she asked softly, fighting to keep her voice steady. The lawyer offered a sympathetic, fleeting smile. "I'm afraid not, Miss Prescott. Your grandmother delivered it to my care precisely in this condition 3 weeks before her passing. She left no key and no further instructions. Probably just full of old mothballs." Reginald chimed in, checking his phone. "I'd toss it in the river on your way home, Abby. Save yourself the bus fare." Abigail didn't look at them. She hoisted the heavy iron box into her arms, the rusted metal catching and tearing slightly at the cheap fabric of her dress. She held her head high, refusing to let them see the tears of betrayal burning in her eyes. She had given Eleanor her youth, her energy, and her heart. In return, she had been handed a piece of worthless, rusted trash, while the family vultures feasted on the gold. The journey back to her cramped studio apartment in Somerville was a nightmare. The box weighed at least 20 pounds, its jagged edges digging violently into Abigail's ribs as she navigated the crowded subway. By the time she unlocked her door, her arms were trembling, and her dress was stained with dark reddish-brown streaks of rust. She dropped the box onto her tiny chipped formica kitchen table with a resounding crash. The apartment smelled faintly of cheap ramen noodles and damp brick. She sank into a wobbly dining chair and finally let the tears fall. It wasn't just the money. It was the profound cruelty of it all. Eleanor had known exactly what she was doing. Her phone buzzed on the counter. The caller ID flashed Harrison's name. Abigail debated ignoring it, but a morbid curiosity compelled her to answer. "Did you make it back to your hovel without pulling a muscle?" Harrison's voice was laced with smug satisfaction. "What do you want, Harrison?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Just a friendly check-in," he said smoothly. "And a bit of advice. Don't bother trying to break that monstrosity open. There's nothing inside. I know because I'm the one who suggested she give it to you." Abigail's breath hitched. "What?" "Oh, come on, Abby. You didn't really think your little Florence Nightingale act fooled anyone, did you? Grandmother knew you were just hanging around, hoping for a payday. A few weeks before she died, she asked me what she should leave you. I told her you were far too spiritual for cash. I reminded her of that hideous piece of junk the gardeners dug up near the old carriage house a decade ago. She laughed so hard she choked. We thought it was the perfect metaphor for your relationship, heavy, burdensome, and entirely devoid of value. Enjoy your inheritance, sis." The line went dead. Abigail sat frozen, the phone slipping from her fingers. The betrayal was complete. It wasn't just an oversight. It was a calculated insult, orchestrated by her brother and endorsed by the grandmother she had loved. A fierce, burning anger began to replace her sorrow. She glared at the rusted box. She wanted to throw it out the window to watch it shatter on the pavement below. But she was desperate. Her bank account was overdrawn by $12. Her rent was due in 3 days, and her credit cards were maxed out from paying for her own medical insurance while she had been unemployed caring for Eleanor. Maybe the metal itself was worth something. It was incredibly heavy. Maybe it was solid brass under the rust, or perhaps a heavy iron antique that some eccentric collector would pay $100 for. $100 meant groceries and breathing room. She went to the sink, found an old toothbrush, some baking soda, and a bottle of harsh chemical cleaner she used for her oven. Returning to the table, she began to scrub aggressively at the top of the box. For 20 minutes, the grime stubbornly resisted, flaking off in greasy black chunks. But as she scrubbed near the front clasp, right above the rusted padlock, the chemicals ate through a thick layer of oxidation. Abigail stopped her arm aching. Beneath the black soot, a patch of metal gleamed. But it wasn't brass, and it wasn't iron. It was a dull, greyish-white metal that didn't tarnish like silver, and stamped into this small, cleared section was an intricate, microscopic engraving, a double-headed eagle clashing with a winged serpent encircled by a ring of thorns. Below the crest were 3 letters deeply etched into the metal FGB. It meant nothing to her, but the precision of the engraving on something so seemingly primitive gave her pause. Wrapping the heavy box in an old bath towel, Abigail shoved it into a canvas tote bag. She knew exactly where she had to go, even though she dreaded it. Down on Charles Street, nestled among boutique coffee shops and luxury boutiques, was Reed & Sons Antiquities. It was the most prestigious, intimidating antique dealership in the city, known for handling museum-quality artifacts. If anyone could tell her if the metal was worth scrapping, it was them. The bell above the door chimed a soft, melodic note as Abigail wrestled the heavy tote bag into the shop. The air inside was climate-controlled and smelled richly of beeswax, lemon oil, and aged vellum. Glass display cases housed gleaming pocket watches, ancient illuminated manuscripts, and flawless porcelain vases. Behind the main counter stood Nathaniel Reed. He was a tall, lean man in his late 50s, wearing a pristine tweed waistcoat and adjusting a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses. He possessed a reputation for having a brilliant eye and an utterly merciless demeanor. He looked up as Abigail approached his eyes, sweeping over her rust-stained dress and disheveled hair, then down to the bulky canvas bag. His expression immediately hardened into a mask of polite disdain. "Can I help you, miss? If you are looking for directions to the subway, it is 2 blocks down." "I'm not looking for directions," Abigail said, hoisting the bag onto the glass counter. Nathaniel winced, instinctively terrified for the glass. "I have an item. I need an appraisal, or at least I need to know if it's worth selling for scrap." Nathaniel let out a long, theatrical sigh. "Ms. Prescott. Abigail Prescott." "Ms. Prescott, we deal in fine antiquities. We are not a pawn shop, nor do we operate a salvage yard. I suggest you take whatever mechanical detritus you have in that bag to a scrap yard in Southie." "Please," Abigail said, her voice cracking slightly under the weight of her exhaustion. "Just look at it. Just for 10 seconds. My family. They gave this to me as a joke. I just need to know if it's completely worthless." Something in her desperate tone made Nathaniel pause. He looked at her exhausted eyes, then back at the bag. 10 seconds, he said curtly. "Then you must leave. We have serious clients arriving shortly." Abigail pulled the towel back, exposing the blackened, rusted monstrosity. It looked even worse under the brilliant halogen lights of the high-end shop. Nathaniel didn't even lean in. "It's a rusted carriage strongbox, mid-19th century perhaps. Mass-produced, worth absolutely nothing. Take it off my counter." "Wait," Abigail said quickly, turning the heavy box around. "Look here. Where I cleaned it, there's a mark." Rolling his eyes, Nathaniel reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a jeweler's loupe. He leaned over the counter, affixing the small magnifying glass to his right eye. He brought his face close to the patch Abigail had scrubbed clean, intending to glance at it for a fraction of a second, just to appease her. Instead, he froze. Abigail watched as the antique dealer stopped breathing. His nose was mere inches from the exposed grey metal. For a long, agonizing moment, the shop was dead silent. Slowly, Nathaniel reached out a trembling gloved finger and traced the microscopic crest of the eagle and serpent. He then traced the letters FGB. When Nathaniel finally pulled his head back, his face had drained of all color. The haughty, dismissive attitude had vanished entirely. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. His hands, previously resting casually on the glass, were now gripping the edge of the counter with white-knuckled intensity. He reached under the counter and pulled out a small dropper bottle of specialized solvent and a fine microfiber cloth. Ignoring his previous mandate that she leave, he applied a single drop of the solvent to the grey metal and wiped it gently. The metal gleamed not silver but an unmistakable heavy luster of raw platinum. "Dear God," Nathaniel whispered. The loop fell from his eye, clattering against the glass counter. He looked up at Abigail, and to her utter shock, tears were welling in his eyes. A single tear escaped, cutting a track down his pale cheek and splashing silently onto the glass between them. Miss Prescott, his voice was hoarse, stripped of all its former arrogance, trembling with raw, unrestrained emotion. "Where, in God's name, did you get this?" Silence stretched across the elegant antique shop, broken only by the frantic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Nathaniel Reed, a man known throughout Boston's elite circles for his icy composure, stood paralyzed behind his glass counter. He stared at the small, scrubbed patch of grey metal as if it were a religious relic. Abigail gripped the edge of the display case, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Mr. Reed, what is it? What does FGB mean?" Nathaniel slowly reached out and locked the front door of his shop, flipping the sign to "Closed" with trembling fingers. He pulled the heavy velvet curtains shut, casting the room into a hushed amber gloom, illuminated only by the display lights. "Ms. Prescott." Nathaniel breathed his voice barely above a whisper. For nearly 70 years, historians and gemologists believed this item was sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. You asked if this metal was solid brass or iron. It is neither. This entire casting, weighing upwards of 20 pounds, is solid, unalloyed platinum. Abigail's knees buckled slightly. Platinum. The sheer weight of the box meant the raw metal alone was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But Nathaniel was not finished. "The metal is merely the canvas." He continued, rushing to a massive oak filing cabinet and pulling out a heavy leather-bound reference book. He flipped rapidly through the glossy pages until he landed on a faded black-and-white photograph of an intricate seal, the exact double-headed eagle and winged serpent Abigail had uncovered. "FGB stands for François Guillaume Bapst," Nathaniel explained, tapping the page with reverence. He was a master jeweler for the French crown, a contemporary of Cartier and Fabergé. In the early 20th century, a fiercely private American industrialist, rumored to be a silent partner of J.P. Morgan himself, commissioned Bapst to create an impenetrable transport vault. It was designed to move a collection of impossible value across the ocean without drawing attention. Bapst coated the pure platinum in a specialized hardened iron oxide compound. It was designed to look like worthless industrial scrap so that thieves would ignore it. Abigail's mind reeled. My grandmother. Her grandfather was a shipping magnate in the 1920s. He worked with J.P. Morgan. Then this is it, Nathaniel said, a manic gleam entering his eyes. The legendary Bapst strongbox. Sotheby's and Christie's have had standing bounties for information on its whereabouts since the 1980s. The Smithsonian Institution has an entire empty display plinth waiting for it in their vault. But Miss Prescott, the box, was just the vessel. Do you have any idea what is inside? Mr. Pendleton said there was no key. She stammered, pulling her rust-stained coat tighter around her shoulders. Bapst despised keys, Nathaniel said with a sudden breathless laugh. Keys can be stolen. Keys can be copied. He built mechanical puzzles. The antique dealer pulled on a pair of pristine white cotton gloves. He moved his hands over the rusted soot-covered top of the box. If the historical schematics documented in the archives of Lloyd's of London are accurate, the release mechanism is hidden within the dimensions of the box itself. He pressed firmly on the left front corner, then slid his thumb down the side, pushing against a piece of rusted brass that looked like a simple rivet. A sharp mechanical click echoed in the quiet shop. Nathaniel repeated the process on the opposite side, then applied pressure to the base of the rusted padlock. Instead of opening the entire front plate of the box, shifted downwards by half an inch, revealing a hidden seam. Dust and flakes of rust rained down onto the glass counter. With a final reverent push, Nathaniel lifted the heavy platinum lid. The interior was a stark contrast to the hideous exterior. It was lined in perfectly preserved midnight blue velvet. Nestled securely within the plush lining were 3 items: a large, heavy pouch made of woven gold thread, a stack of antique bearer bonds, and a sealed envelope bearing the Prescott family crest in crimson wax. Nathaniel carefully lifted the gold pouch and gently untied the silk cord. As he tipped the contents onto a black velvet jeweler's tray, the ambient light in the room seemed to catch fire. Abigail gasped. Resting on the dark fabric was a necklace of unimaginable beauty. It featured a staggering array of flawless, cushion-cut pink diamonds, culminating in a central stone the size of a quail's egg, radiating a deep, mesmerizing magenta brilliance. The Empress Josephine Rose. Nathaniel choked out, falling back against the shelving behind him. Insured by Lloyd's of London in 1922 for $4 million. Today its value is practically incalculable, easily north of $80 million at auction. Plus the platinum box, plus these bonds. He looked at Abigail, his eyes wide. You are sitting on one of the greatest private fortunes in American history. Abigail did not look at the diamonds. Her eyes were fixed on the envelope. She reached out with a trembling hand, breaking the old wax seal. Inside was a piece of heavy stationery, covered in Eleanor Prescott's sharp, elegant handwriting. My dearest Abigail. If you are reading this, it means you did exactly what I knew you would do. You did not throw away a heavy burden just because it was ugly. You carried it just as you carried me in my final years. Harrison and Cynthia are fools. They see only the surface of things. I allowed Harrison to believe he was orchestrating a grand humiliation for you. I allowed him to suggest this rusted junk as your inheritance. It was the only way to ensure the true family legacy passed to the only person worthy of protecting it. Enjoy your life, my sweet girl. You have earned every brilliant facet of it. With all my love, grandmother. News of the discovery did not stay quiet for long. Within 48 hours, Nathaniel Reed had discreetly contacted the head of antiquities at Sotheby's to authenticate the Bapst Strong box and the Empress Josephine Rose. In the world of elite auctions, whispers travel faster than light. By Friday morning, the story of the lost Prescott treasure had reached the manicured suburbs of Chestnut Hill. Abigail was sitting in a plush private suite at a high-end luxury hotel paid for by a generous advance from Sotheby's when the inevitable knock came at the door. She opened it to find Harrison, his face purple with rage, flanked by Arthur Pendleton and 2 men in expensive tailored suits carrying thick leather briefcases. Cynthia hovered behind them, her eyes darting nervously around the opulent suite. "You stole it!" Harrison spat, pushing his way into the room without an invitation. "You manipulated a dying woman into giving you the family's most valuable asset." Abigail stood her ground, her posture straight, wearing a tailored navy blazer and crisp trousers that had replaced her clearance rack morning dress. "She left me the box, Harrison. You were in the room. You laughed about it, remember?" "That was a mistake," Cynthia shrieked, clutching her designer handbag. "She didn't know what was inside. She had dementia. We are challenging the will." One of the sharp-suited lawyers stepped forward. "Ms. Prescott, I represent your brother. We have already filed an emergency injunction to freeze the auction of the diamonds and the platinum strongbox. The contents of that box clearly belong to the primary estate, which was awarded to my client. We are prepared to tie this up in litigation for decades unless you surrender the assets immediately." Abigail smiled. It was a cold, calm smile that she had learned from watching Eleanor negotiate with ruthless contractors. "Mr. Pendleton," Abigail said, turning to the family lawyer, who looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Did you bring the updated financial dossiers for the estate properties as requested by my new legal counsel?" Harrison frowned, momentarily derailed. "What is she talking about, Pendleton? What new legal counsel?" From the adjoining bedroom, a tall woman in a sharp grey suit emerged. It was Evelyn Vance. No, Abigail reminded herself of her new attorney's actual name, Evelyn Sterling. No Evelyn Carmichael, a former federal prosecutor, and now a senior partner at the most feared corporate litigation firm in Manhattan. Abigail had retained her services yesterday. "Mr. Prescott," Evelyn Carmichael said, handing a thick bound folder to Harrison's lawyers. "I suggest you look at the true state of the assets your client inherited. Eleanor Prescott was a brilliant woman, but she was also deeply vindictive toward those who disappointed her." Harrison snatched the folder, ripping it open. His eyes scanned the first few pages, and the purple rage in his face rapidly drained into a sickly, chalky white. "What is this?" he whispered, his hands beginning to shake. "This says the Manhattan commercial property has $80 million in toxic environmental liens attached to it." "Correct," Evelyn said crisply. "Decades of illegal chemical dumping by a previous tenant. The EPA finally issued the cleanup mandate a week before your grandmother passed. As the new owner, you are entirely liable for the remediation costs." "And the stock portfolio?" Cynthia demanded, her voice rising in panic. "Leverage to the absolute hilt," Evelyn replied, crossing her arms. Eleanor took out massive undisclosed margin loans against the primary portfolio to fund a series of catastrophic offshore investments 3 years ago. The banks are calling in the margins next Tuesday. The Chestnut Hill mansion has 3 hidden mortgages on it. It's facing foreclosure by the end of the month. Harrison stumbled backward, collapsing onto a velvet sofa. The empire he thought he had inherited was a hollow, rotting shell. It was a labyrinth of debt lawsuits and crushing liabilities. Eleanor had intentionally insulated the true wealth, the unrecorded, untraceable historical artifacts, inside the ugly iron box, knowing Harrison's own arrogance would prevent him from ever looking closely at it. "She ruined me," Harrison gasped, pulling at his expensive silk tie as if it were choking him. "I'm bankrupt. Worse than bankrupt." "She didn't ruin you, Harrison," Abigail said quietly, walking over to stand above him. "She just gave you exactly what you asked for. You wanted the grand facade, the impressive titles, the properties you could brag about at the country club. You wanted the things that looked valuable on the outside. You left the heavy, difficult, ugly work to me." She looked at Cynthia, who was now quietly weeping into her hands, the illusion of her extravagant life shattered in an instant. "The injunction against my assets will be dropped by 5 o'clock today," Abigail instructed Harrison's lawyers, who were already backing toward the door, realizing their client could no longer afford to pay them. "If it isn't, Ms. Carmichael will file a countersuit for harassment that will drain whatever pennies you have left." Harrison didn't argue. He didn't even look up as Abigail opened the door to the suite, silently demanding they leave. They filed out like ghosts, stripped of their power and their pride, walking back into a world where they owed millions they did not have. Abigail closed the door, the solid thud echoing with a profound sense of finality. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling Boston skyline. The heavy weight of the last 5 years, the sleepless nights, the debt, the endless mockery from her family, had finally lifted. She touched the small velvet box sitting on the coffee table, holding one of the smaller pink diamonds she had kept as a personal memento. Her grandmother had been right. Sometimes the most priceless treasures in the world are hidden beneath layers of rust, waiting only for someone willing to put in the hard work to uncover them. Did Abigail's incredible hidden treasure story leave you completely speechless? Sometimes the most beautiful things are disguised as heavy burdens. If you loved this satisfying twist of karma and want more jaw-dropping real-life drama and inheritance mysteries, hit that like button. Right now, don't forget to share this story with your friends and family and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another amazing video. Leave a comment below. What would you do if you found millions in a rusted box?